He thought calling her up would be a harmless joke, but within minutes, he would wish he had never said her name out loud. The grand rehearsal hall of Westbridge Conservatory shimmered under warm chandelier light, polished wooden floors reflecting rows of eager students seated in curved tiers, their notebooks open, their eyes fixed on the man at the center of it all, Professor Daniel Whitmore, a name that carried weight far beyond the walls of the institution. Known across the country for shaping elite vocalists, and equally known for dismantling those he deemed unworthy, Whitmore stood with the quiet authority of someone who had never once been questioned. His tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks, and perfectly measured tone projected a message everyone understood: this was not a place for amateurs. And certainly not for mistakes. Opera, he said slowly, pacing in front of the class, is not just singing. It is discipline, control, and above all, worthiness. A few students nodded, others scribbled his words like doctrine. Near the back of the hall, almost invisible against the shadowed wall, stood Emily Carter. Dressed in a simple gray cardigan and worn black flats, she held a cleaning cloth loosely in her hand, having paused mid-task when the lecture began. She had learned long ago how to move quietly in places like this, how to exist without being noticed, how to blend into the background so completely that people forgot she was even there. And yet, as Whitmore continued, her eyes lifted slightly, drawn not to him, but to the piano resting at center stage. Now, Whitmore continued, turning sharply, who here believes they can handle Verdi's Sempre Libera? A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the room. No one raised their hand. It was a notoriously difficult aria, one that required precision, stamina, and emotional command far beyond the average student's reach. Whitmore smiled thinly. Exactly. His gaze drifted across the room, then stopped. Not on a student. On Emily. The faintest flicker of amusement crossed his face. You, he said, his voice cutting through the air. Yes, you in the back. The one pretending not to listen. The room turned. Every head pivoted toward her. Emily froze for half a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the cloth. Come forward, Whitmore said, gesturing toward the stage with casual dismissal. Since you seem so interested, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate. A few students chuckled under their breath. Someone whispered, isn't she the cleaning lady? Another voice followed, softer but sharper, this should be good. Emily stepped forward slowly, her footsteps barely audible against the polished floor, yet somehow echoing louder than any sound in the room. The distance to the stage felt longer than it should have, every step carrying the weight of eyes that had already judged her. Whitmore handed her a sheet of music, his expression unreadable but his intention unmistakable. Take your time, he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. We're all very eager to see what you can do. The room grew still, an almost electric silence settling over the audience. Emily glanced down at the page. The notes were familiar, painfully, intimately familiar. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Something else. Something older. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. She lifted her head, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly. And for the first time since she had entered that room, she was no longer invisible. The air shifted. The silence deepened. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a student stopped breathing mid-laugh. Because in that single, quiet moment, something didn't feel like a joke anymore. Emily stood at the center of the stage with the sheet of music resting lightly in her hands, the paper barely trembling despite the weight of the moment pressing in from every direction, and for a few seconds she did nothing at all, not a single movement, not a breath loud enough to be noticed, as if she were listening to something deeper than the room itself, something only she could hear, while Professor Whitmore folded his arms and tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming as he watched the silence stretch longer than expected, confident that hesitation would soon turn into embarrassment, because he had seen this pattern before, countless times, nervous students freezing under pressure, their confidence collapsing under the weight of expectation, but this did not look like fear, not exactly, and that subtle difference began to unsettle something he could not quite name, while the students exchanged glances, some amused, some impatient, waiting for the inevitable stumble that would confirm what they already believed, that she did not belong here, that this was a spectacle, not a performance, and somewhere in the second row, a young soprano leaned forward with a quiet frown, sensing that something about the stillness felt deliberate, as if time itself had slowed down to watch what would happen next, and then Emily moved, not dramatically, not with any attempt to command attention, but with a quiet, controlled motion as she placed the sheet of music onto the piano stand, her fingers brushing the edge with a familiarity that did not match the assumptions surrounding her, and when she straightened, her posture shifted in a way so subtle yet so undeniable that it changed the air in the room, her shoulders relaxed, her chin lifted just enough, her gaze no longer searching but steady, grounded, and for the first time, she looked like someone who was not being tested, but someone who had already decided the outcome, and Whitmore noticed it, that small shift, that quiet confidence. And it irritated him more than hesitation ever could, because confidence without permission was something he did not tolerate easily. "Well," he said, his voice sharper now, cutting through the silence like a conductor's baton striking the stand, "we do not have all day." A few scattered laughs followed, but they sounded thinner this time, less certain, as Emily inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came not from nerves but from training, deep and measured, filling her lungs with precision, and in that inhale, something changed again, something almost imperceptible yet impossible to ignore, like the moment before a storm breaks, and even those who had been smiling felt their expressions falter, because instinct recognized what logic had not yet caught up to, and as she exhaled, her lips parted slightly, but she did not begin immediately. She waited, just a fraction longer, as if aligning herself with an invisible rhythm, and Whitmore's smirk began to fade, replaced by a flicker of curiosity he tried to suppress, because this was not how these moments usually unfolded. There was supposed to be panic, apology, retreat, but instead there was stillness, control, intention, and the room responded in kind. The restless shifting stopped, the whispers died out completely, even the faint hum of the overhead light seemed to fade into the background, until the entire hall felt suspended in a fragile, expectant silence, and in that silence, Emily closed her eyes for just a heartbeat, not to escape, but to remember, and whatever she saw in that brief moment did not bring hesitation, it brought clarity, because when her eyes opened again, they carried something unmistakable, something that did not belong to a hesitant employee or an outsider standing in the wrong place, but to someone who had stood on stages far larger than this, under lights far brighter, in front of audiences far less forgiving, and as that realization began to ripple quietly through the room, not fully understood but deeply felt, one truth settled over everyone present, unspoken yet undeniable: this was no longer a test, and whatever happened next would not go the way anyone had expected. The first note did not arrive with hesitation, it arrived with precision, clean and centered, cutting through the silence with a clarity so controlled that it did not feel like a beginning but a continuation of something that had never truly stopped, and in that instant the room changed, not gradually but all at once, as if every assumption that had been quietly resting in the minds of those watching was suddenly pulled away without warning, because this was not the strained, uncertain voice they had expected. This was resonance, trained and deliberate, filling the space without force, and Emily did not rush, she did not try to impress, she allowed the phrase to unfold naturally, each note placed with intention, each breath timed with discipline, and within seconds it became undeniable that she was not following the music, she was guiding it, shaping it, owning it in a way that only comes from years of experience no one in that room had ever imagined she possessed, and the students who had been leaning back in casual amusement found themselves sitting upright without realizing it, their expressions tightening as their ears caught details they could not ignore, the subtle control in her vibrato, the effortless transition between registers, the emotional depth carried not through exaggeration but restraint, and somewhere near the front, the young soprano who had sensed something earlier felt her pulse quicken, because what she was hearing was not just correct, it was refined, dangerously refined, and Professor Whitmore, who had begun this demonstration with folded arms and quiet confidence, slowly lowered them without noticing, his posture shifting as his mind tried to reconcile what his ears were telling him with what his eyes insisted could not be true, because this level of control did not belong to someone who cleaned rehearsal halls and kept her head down, it belonged to professionals, to performers who had stood under stage lights and carried entire orchestras with their voice alone, and yet here she was, standing in front of him, wearing nothing that suggested status, offering nothing but sound, and that sound was dismantling everything he thought he understood, and Emily continued, her voice rising now into the more demanding passages, the kind that exposed weakness instantly, the kind Whitmore had chosen specifically to ensure failure, but there was no strain, no hesitation, only a seamless expansion, her tone growing richer, fuller, filling the hall with a presence that felt almost tangible, and for the first time, no one in the room was thinking about who she was supposed to be, they were listening, fully, completely. And the silence between notes became just as powerful as the notes themselves, each pause deliberate, each phrase carrying weight, and the room responded with stillness so complete it felt like time had slowed down to accommodate her, and Whitmore felt it too, that uncomfortable realization settling deeper with every passing second, that this was no accident, no lucky moment, this was mastery, controlled and undeniable, and as she moved into the final sequence, the most complex section of the aria, the one he had expected to break her completely, something else happened, something he had not planned for, she did not just execute it, she transformed it, adding nuance, shaping the phrasing with an emotional intelligence that could not be taught in classrooms or measured in grades, and that was when the first crack appeared in his certainty, small but irreversible, because technique could be dismissed, but interpretation revealed truth, and the truth now standing on that stage was impossible to ignore, and across the room, students who had once whispered found themselves holding their breath, not out of anticipation of failure, but out of fear that any sound might interrupt what they were witnessing, because this was no longer a demonstration. It was a performance, and not the kind that asked for approval, but the kind that commanded it without ever needing to ask, and as Emily approached the final note, her gaze steady, her posture grounded, her presence undeniable, one realization settled over the room with quiet certainty, the woman they had laughed at moments ago was not out of place, they were, and nothing in that room would feel the same after the sound of her voice faded. The final note did not end abruptly, it lingered, suspended in the air with a control so precise it felt as though even silence had been rehearsed, and when it finally faded, it did not disappear, it settled, like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or explained away, and for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the room had entered a kind of stillness that only truth can create, a stillness that forces people to confront what they had just witnessed without the comfort of denial, and Emily did not rush to fill that silence, she simply lowered her chin slightly, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if what she had just done required no acknowledgement, no reaction, no validation, and that quiet confidence unsettled the room more than any dramatic gesture ever could, because it left no room for interpretation, only acceptance, and in the front row, a student's pen slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have, breaking the spell just enough for reality to return in fragments, heads turning, eyes widening, breaths finally released, and then came the shift, subtle at first, a glance exchanged, a whisper that did not quite form into words, because no one seemed certain what to say, and Professor Whitmore stood frozen where he was, his expression caught between disbelief and calculation, his mind racing through possibilities, searching for an explanation that would restore his authority, but none came, because there was no flaw to point to, no mistake to highlight, nothing he could dissect or critique in the way he had built his reputation on doing, and that absence of weakness was what unsettled him most, because it left him exposed, standing in front of his own students with nothing to correct, nothing to fix, nothing to prove, and for the first time in a long time, he was not in control of the room, and he felt it, that subtle shift in energy, the way attention no longer centered on him but on her, and it irritated something deeper than pride, something closer to fear, because authority without control is fragile, and fragile things do not last, and across the hall, the young soprano who had been watching leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke to the student beside her. That was not just training, she said, her eyes still fixed on Emily, that was experience, and the word hung there, quiet but heavy, because it suggested something none of them had considered, that the woman they had dismissed so easily had a past far more significant than her present appearance revealed, and Emily reached for the sheet of music, not hurried, not hesitant, simply returning it to the stand as if completing a task, and then she stepped back, one small movement that should have returned her to the background, but did not, because something fundamental had changed, and no amount of stepping back could undo what had just been revealed, and Whitmore finally moved, clearing his throat slightly, a small, controlled gesture meant to re-establish order, but the sound felt forced, thinner than usual, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. That was, he paused, searching for a word that would both acknowledge and diminish, but the language he had always relied on failed him, because excellence does not leave room for reduction, and the silence that followed his unfinished sentence was louder than any criticism could have been, and in that silence, realization began to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like light creeping into a dark room, and the students who had laughed earlier now avoided each other's eyes, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not seeking approval, not challenging, simply observing, and for a brief second her eyes met Whitmore's. And in that moment, there was no defiance, no accusation, only a calm recognition, as if she had already accepted something he was only just beginning to understand, that respect is not granted by position, and authority means nothing in the presence of truth. And then she stepped away from the center of the stage, but the room did not move with her, because everyone there knew, whether they admitted it or not, that what had just happened could not be undone, and whatever came next would not belong to the professor anymore. Emily's footsteps were soft as she moved away from the center of the stage, but every step carried a weight the room could feel, as if the echo of her voice had not fully left the air, and no one seemed willing to break the fragile balance that had settled over them, because once silence is earned, it demands to be respected, and for a moment, it looked as though the world had simply paused, suspended between what had just happened and what came next, until Professor Whitmore straightened his posture, forcing his shoulders back in a practiced motion, attempting to reclaim the authority that had slipped through his fingers without warning, and when he spoke again, his voice was controlled, measured, but no longer absolute. "Miss Carter," he said, carefully choosing formality now where there had been none before, that was unexpected, and the word felt inadequate the moment it left his mouth, because it tried to reduce something that refused to be reduced, and Emily stopped, turning slightly, her expression calm, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. And in that presence there was a quiet strength that made his next words more difficult than he anticipated, where, he continued, his tone tightening just slightly, "Did you learn to sing like that?" The question lingered, not just as curiosity, but as an attempt to regain footing, to place her within a category he could understand, because what cannot be labeled cannot be controlled, and the students leaned forward again, drawn back into the moment, their earlier embarrassment now replaced with anticipation, because this was no longer about a mistake, this was about a mystery, and Emily held his gaze for a brief second before answering, her voice softer than her singing but just as steady. "I did not learn it here," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it suggested an entire history that existed beyond the walls they all believed defined excellence, and a murmur moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, as if a hidden narrative had just been confirmed without needing details, and Whitmore felt it, that shift again, that loss of center, and it pressed against his composure in ways he was not used to managing, because he had built his reputation on being the source of answers, not the one asking questions, and yet here he was, standing in front of his students, uncertain, searching, and that uncertainty was visible now, no matter how carefully he tried to conceal it, and Emily took another step back, returning the cleaning cloth to her hand, the same small, ordinary object that had defined her role only minutes ago. But now it looked different, not because it had changed, but because they had, and perception, once altered, does not easily return to its original state, and the young soprano in the front row spoke again, louder this time, unable to contain the realization forming in her mind. "I have heard that phrasing before," she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and disbelief, "that interpretation, it sounds like recordings from the Metropolitan Opera," and the words landed with quiet force, not shouted, not dramatic, but precise, and several heads turned instantly, eyes widening as the implication settled in. Because that was not a comparison made lightly, not in a room like this, not among students trained to recognize the difference between skill and greatness, and Whitmore's expression shifted again, something sharper now, something more alert, because recognition changes everything. It removes doubt, it replaces speculation with direction, and he looked at Emily more closely this time, not as a subject to correct, but as a problem to solve, his mind searching through names, faces, performances he had studied and critiqued over decades. And for a brief moment, something flickered across his face. A trace of familiarity he could not yet fully grasp, and Emily saw it, that flicker, that moment when understanding begins to form but has not yet found its final shape, and she did not interrupt it, she did not rush to explain or defend, she simply stood there, calm, composed, allowing the truth to rise on its own, because truth, when undeniable, does not need to be announced, it reveals itself. And as the room held its breath once more, not out of doubt this time but out of recognition slowly taking hold, one thing became clear to everyone present: this moment was no longer about what she could do, it was about who she had always been, and the answer was already closer than any of them realized. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, slowly, carefully, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it for too long, and in that fragile space between realization and certainty, Professor Whitmore took a step closer, not toward authority, but toward understanding, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Emily with a focus that was no longer dismissive but searching, almost unsettled, because something in her presence refused to fit the narrative he had already constructed, and narratives, once challenged, do not collapse quietly, they resist, they demand proof, and that was exactly what his mind was doing now, moving through years of memory, through performances he had attended, recordings he had analyzed, voices he had critiqued, trying to align what he had just heard with something recognizable, something known, and then it came, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet alignment, a detail falling into place, the phrasing, the restraint, the way. She held the final note just slightly longer than expected, not for effect, but for meaning, and his expression shifted, subtly but unmistakably, as the weight of that recognition began to settle in, because there are voices you do not forget, no matter how much time passes, and there are performances that leave marks deeper than applause, and he had heard this before, years ago, on a stage far from this room, under lights far brighter than these, and for the first time since this moment began. He did not speak immediately, because words, when they arrive too quickly, can betray uncertainty, and he was not ready to reveal how much of his certainty had already begun to unravel, while the students watched closely, sensing that something important was happening just beneath the surface, something they could not yet fully see but could feel building, like tension before a storm that no one had predicted, and Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not waiting for approval, not seeking explanation, simply allowing the moment to unfold as it would, because she understood something they did not, that truth does not need to rush, it arrives in its own time, and when it does not ask permission to be believed, and Whitmore finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to carry more than just air, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Stripped of the sharp edges it had carried before, there was a performance, he said, almost to himself, though everyone heard it, 10 years ago, in New York, a debut that changed everything, and the room leaned in without moving, because now they understood, this was no longer speculation, this was connection, and his eyes locked onto hers with a new intensity, not dominance, not superiority, but recognition. The soprano, he continued, his voice steady now but undeniably different, disappeared shortly after. No interviews, no farewell, just gone, and the weight of his words settled over the room, heavy with implication, as the students exchanged quick glances, their earlier assumptions dissolving completely, replaced by something closer to awe, because they all knew the story. Even if they had only heard it in fragments, a voice that had once dominated conversations among critics, a talent described as rare, almost once in a generation, and then silence, unexplained and complete, and now that silence was standing in front of them, holding a cleaning cloth, wearing a gray cardigan, as if none of it had ever happened, and Whitmore's final question did not come with authority, it came with something far more vulnerable, something he had not shown in years, Emily Carter. He said, carefully, as if testing the weight of the name itself, or should I say, someone else, and the room went completely still again, not with anticipation this time, but with understanding waiting to be confirmed, and Emily's gaze did not waver, her expression unchanged, because she had always known this moment would come eventually, not planned, not staged, but inevitable, because no matter how far you step away from something that defines you, it never truly leaves, it waits, quietly. Until the world is ready to recognize it again, and in that silence, before she spoke, everyone in that room realized something they would not forget, that greatness does not disappear, it only hides, and when it returns, it does so on its own terms. Emily did not answer immediately, and that silence, deliberate and unhurried, carried more authority than any immediate response could have, because it forced everyone in the room to sit with the weight of what had just been uncovered, and Professor Whitmore, who had spent decades controlling conversations with precision, found himself waiting, not out of politeness, but because he no longer had the power to rush the moment forward, and that realization settled into him with a quiet discomfort he could not disguise, while the students remained frozen in place, their earlier curiosity now sharpened into something deeper, something closer to realization, because the pieces were aligning whether they were ready or not, and Emily finally lifted her gaze slightly, not to challenge, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge what had already been said without giving it more power than it deserved. Names change, she said softly, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably certain, but the work does not, and the simplicity of her words carried a truth that resonated far beyond explanation, because it did not deny what Whitmore had implied, but it did not surrender to it either, and a quiet ripple moved through the room, not confusion this time, but understanding taking shape. As if everyone present had just been given the final piece of a puzzle they had not realized they were assembling, and Whitmore felt it more than anyone, that shift from control to recognition, from authority to humility, and it unsettled him in a way he had not experienced in years, because for the first time, he was no longer evaluating talent, he was standing in the presence of it, and that distinction changed everything, and he took another step forward, slower this time, measured, as if careful not to disrupt what had already been established. "You left," he said, not accusing, not questioning, but stating a fact that carried its own weight, and Emily nodded slightly, a movement so small it could have been missed if anyone had looked away, but no one did. "Yes," she replied, and that single word held more depth than any explanation could have offered, because it contained years of silence, choices made beyond public understanding, and a life lived outside the expectations of an industry that rarely allowed such disappearances without consequence. And Whitmore's eyes searched her face again, not for flaws, not for answers, but for something else, something he had never needed to look for before, perspective, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than it had ever been in that room. "Do you intend to return?" And the question hung in the air, not as a demand, but as a possibility, one that carried implications far beyond the walls of the conservatory, and the students leaned in once more, their attention no longer driven by curiosity, but by something closer to admiration, because they understood now that they were witnessing not just a moment of revelation, but a moment of choice, and Emily's expression remained composed, her posture unchanged, as if the question itself did not carry the weight others assumed it did, and after a brief pause, she answered, "I never left," and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that shifted everything once again, because they reframed the entire narrative, not as a disappearance, but as a continuation unseen, unheard, unnoticed by those who believed visibility defined existence, and Whitmore's breath caught slightly, not visibly, but enough that the change could be felt, because that answer stripped away the last layer of assumption he had been holding on to, and in its place stood a truth far more difficult to ignore, that greatness does not depend on recognition to exist, it simply exists, regardless of who is paying attention, and across the room, the students who had once measured themselves against grades and approval now found themselves questioning something deeper, something more foundational, and Emily lowered her gaze briefly, not out of submission, but completion, as if the moment had reached its natural end, and when she stepped back once more, returning toward the edges of the room, no one mistook it for retreat this time, because they understood now that stepping away does not diminish presence, and silence does not erase impact, and as the room remained still, holding on to the weight of everything that had just unfolded, one realization stood clear above all others, that respect is not given by position, it is revealed through truth. And once revealed, it cannot be taken back. No one called her back, no one asked her to stay, and yet no one looked away as Emily moved toward the side of the hall, her presence still anchored at the center of every thought in the room, because once something real has been Revealed, it does not need to remain in the spotlight to be felt, and the silence that followed her steps was no longer uncertain, it was reverent, as if the room itself had shifted into something quieter, something more aware, and Professor Whitmore stood where he was, unmoving, his gaze fixed not on where she had been, but on where she was now, because distance no longer changed what he understood, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to fill the space with instruction or correction, because there was nothing left to correct, and that absence of control forced something else to take its place, something far less comfortable but far more honest, and when he finally spoke, it was not to command the room, but to acknowledge it. "Class dismissed," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its usual sharpness, and the words carried a finality that surprised even him, because he was not ending a lesson, he was stepping out of one, and the students did not move. Immediately, as if they needed a moment to understand what had just been given to them, not as information, but as experience, and slowly, almost reluctantly, chairs shifted, notebooks closed, but the usual noise of departure did not return, because no one wanted to be the first to break the quiet that had become something meaningful, and as they began to file out, their eyes moved not toward Whitmore, but toward Emily, some with hesitation, some with curiosity, and some with something closer to respect, a respect that had not been taught, but earned in a matter of minutes, and the young soprano approached carefully, her steps slower than before, her confidence replaced by something more thoughtful. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice soft but sincere, and Emily turned slightly, meeting her gaze without surprise. "Thank you," the student continued, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, because gratitude offered without expectation reveals something genuine, and Emily gave a small nod, not dismissing it, not amplifying it, simply accepting it for what it was, and one by one, others followed, not with questions, not with demands for explanation, but with quiet acknowledgement, brief glances, subtle gestures, the kind that do not seek attention but still carry meaning, and across the room, Whitmore watched it all unfold, his expression unreadable but no longer guarded, because whatever defenses he had relied on had already been dismantled, not by confrontation, but by truth, and when the last of the students stepped out into the hallway, leaving the room nearly empty, he remained where he was, the echo of their presence still lingering, and Emily moved toward the door, her step steady, her pace unchanged, as if the moment had not altered her path at all, and just before she reached it, Whitmore spoke again, not loudly, not to stop her, but simply to be heard. "Emily," he said, and she paused, turning just enough to acknowledge him, and for a second, he seemed to search for something to say, something that could match the weight of what had just occurred, but the words he had always relied on did not come. Because some moments do not require explanation, they require recognition, and finally, he gave a slight nod, small but deliberate, the kind of gesture that carries more meaning than any speech, and Emily returned it, equally small, equally deliberate, and then she stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, and the room that remained was not the same one it had been before, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be reset or forgotten, and as Whitmore stood alone in that quiet space, one truth settled into him with undeniable clarity, that authority can demand attention, but only truth can command silence, and that silence, once earned, belongs to someone else forever. The hallway outside the rehearsal hall carried the soft echo of footsteps fading into the distance, but inside, something far quieter lingered, something that did not belong to sound at all, and as Emily walked beneath the long row of overhead lights, her reflection passing briefly across polished glass panels, she did not look back, not because the moment meant nothing, but because it had already given everything it needed to give, and moments like that are not meant to be held on to, they are meant to move through you, leaving something behind that cannot be undone, and behind her, inside the now empty hall, Professor Whitmore remained still for longer than he would ever admit, his gaze fixed on the closed door as if expecting it to open again, as if expecting the moment to reverse itself into something familiar, something manageable, but it did not, and slowly, he turned, taking in the space that had once felt entirely his, the rows of seats, the piano at center stage, the quiet air that no longer carried his authority the way it once had, and for the first time in years, he saw it differently, not as a place to shape others, but as a place where he had been shaped without realizing it, and the realization did not come with resistance, it came with clarity, the kind that settles quietly and stays, and later that afternoon, the story began to travel, not through announcements or headlines, but through voices, careful at first, almost hesitant, students. Speaking in low tones about what they had witnessed, about the woman no one had noticed until they could not ignore her, about the way a single performance had shifted an entire room without raising its volume, and by evening, the narrative had already begun to evolve, details sharpening, recognition spreading, fragments of memory connecting to form something undeniable, and somewhere in the city, someone mentioned a name that had once filled concert halls, a voice that critics had described as rare, unforgettable, a presence that had vanished without explanation, and as the pieces aligned, so did the understanding that what had been lost had never truly disappeared, it had simply chosen silence over spectacle, and the following morning, the conservatory felt different, not in structure, not in schedule, but in awareness. Conversations carried a new weight, glances lasted a little longer, assumptions held a little less certainty, because once perspective shifts, it does not return easily, and Professor Whitmore stood once again at the front of the hall, his posture composed, his presence steady, but something in him had changed, something subtle yet permanent, and when he spoke, his words were measured, but no longer absolute. Talent, he said slowly, allowing the word to settle before continuing, does not announce itself, and it does not require recognition to exist, and the students listened differently now, not because the words were new, but because they had seen them proven, and proof changes everything, and across the room, one empty space near the back remained untouched, not because it was reserved, but because it had become something more than a place, it had become a reminder, and though Emily did not return that day, her presence remained, not as a question, not as a mystery, but as a truth that had revealed itself at exactly the right moment, and somewhere beyond the walls of the conservatory, life continued as it always had, ordinary and unremarkable to those who did not know what to look for, and perhaps that was the point, because not all greatness seeks an audience, and not all